My name is Cassia Merrick, 49 years old. The morning of my son's wedding rose with the kind of light that flatters everything it touches. Peonies on the counter, steam curling from a kettle, the pearl button. I could never quite fasten without a mirror. I stood in my small kitchen with my coffee cooling too quickly, and the navy dress I'd pressed the night before hanging from the pantry door like a promise I wasn't sure I could keep. I had chosen it for its quiet, simple lines, sleeves that respected my arms, a hem that didn't ask for attention. Around my neck, I fastened my mother's pearls. The weight was modest, human. They were the one inheritance that had never been argued over. Grief made them mine the moment the clasp clicked shut all those years ago. In the hallway mirror, I saw what strangers would see. A woman who had learned to take up just enough space to avoid questions and not an inch more. The habit was older than the fine lines beside my mouth. At family gatherings, invisibility had been my best armor. You cannot mock what you cannot see. Except, of course, my father always found me. 72 now, sharper with every birthday, he had a way of locating the softest part of any room and pressing a thumb into it like a bruise he wanted to keep fresh. I pinned my hair back the way practical women do, 3 bobby pins that have been with me longer than some friendships, and checked the list I had made for the day. Spare hosiery, tied pen, handkerchief, 2, actually. Wedding days are logistics disguised as romance, and I take comfort in solvable things. When the unsolvable rises, a list is a small raft. Mark texted a photo from the church foyer, his tie, imperfectly knotted, his grin leaning toward panic and joy. My boy, who'd learned to fix a leaky faucet at 8 and drive a stick at 14, was about to promise a life in front of witnesses. "You're fine," I wrote back. "Breathe. You always land the plane." He replied with a plane emoji, and for once, I didn't correct his metaphors. The Hastings Country Club sat on a brow of lawn that behaved like money, even, costly, without seeming to try. The parking lot was a silent roll call of vehicles with their own reputations, the kind of place where no one needed to lock the doors because the doors knew who they belonged to. Inside, a teenage attendant with a practiced smile offered to take my wrap. I kept it. Habit. Rooms can turn cold without warning. The foyer smelled faintly of lemon polish and something floral with a long name. In the ballroom, chandeliers scattered light like applause no one had yet earned. Tables waited in white linen and good intentions. Centerpieces held roses and eucalyptus and a certain kind of restraint that only people with means can afford. Little blackboard signs at the bar announced the signature cocktails. The Hastings Old Fashioned, with top-shelf bourbon and a cherry syrup made in-house. The Villa Spritz with Prosecco that pretended it had grown up in champagne. You can tell a family's values by their bar menu. These people like tradition, but only the kind that doesn't sweat. Jennifer, to her credit, moved through the room like someone who belonged wherever she stood. Lace that wasn't fussy, heels that didn't wobble, a smile that had been schooled to feel unpracticed. When she saw me, she threaded past a cluster of cousins and found my hands. "You look beautiful, Cassia," she said, and I told her the truth. So do you. It is possible to mean it and still be wary of the space between two sentences. In families like hers, and mine, courtesy is a bridge you test with your weight before you cross. At the ceremony, the pastor kept to love, duty, and the sort of jokes that don't bruise the sacred. I watched Mark's hands almost betray him when he slid the ring onto her finger. I loved him for trembling. People who are terrified of love are often terrified of being seen. He looked up at me, and for a moment, the church was as small as a hallway where I once knelt to tie his shoe before the bell rang. If you are lucky, your child's milestones appear like constellations, scattered, shining, and, from a certain angle, connected. In the receiving line, the Hastings measured me in a glance. The mother's smile was courteous, the father's handshake cool. The appraising gleam is a universal language. My father speaks it as a native. I know its grammar by heart, even when it's whispered across expensive carpet. I allowed myself to be neither ashamed nor defensive. Age, if you let it, teaches you to let a gaze pass through you like weather. You carry your own climate and let theirs blow itself out. Back in the ballroom, the band tested a melody everyone would recognize later when it was safe to relax. I found my name on a place card written in precise strokes that suggested a contract rather than a welcome. My table mates introduced themselves as friends of the Hastings. We play 9 and dine on Wednesdays, the woman to my left announced, as though we were trading passports. 18 holes and dinner, her husband added, and the same 4 jokes every week. The table laughed on cue. The choreography of belonging is a dance you can learn, but the music sometimes refuses you. What do you do? The woman asked, eyes flicking to my dress, my shoes, my hands. People like a story they can set down easily. I have learned to hand them something light. Administrative work, I said. Lots of planning. Not untrue. Not the whole story. The fuller version has its own weight, its own set of eyes, its own ghosts and ribbons that mean what they mean, whether anyone names them or not. I have become fluent in the art of partial answers. Across the room, Mark stood with his groomsmen, tall among them, but still my boy. I could find him in a crowd the way your ear finds your name in a noisy room. The men at his side were less polished than the Hastings set and more self-contained, wearing tuxedos like loaned armor rather than silk skin. They laughed softly with their shoulders, not their mouths, and I recognized in their stillness a thing you can't fake. When you have carried weight together, you lean differently. You don't need to scan a room to know where the exits are. Your body keeps the map even when your mind is busy with small talk. I felt the familiar pull then, a private urge to keep my secrets buttoned, to pass like a pedestrian through the evening without incident. Invisibility is a skill, and like any skill, it has a cost. You forget, after a while, that you are camouflaging yourself from people who would love you if you let them, and preserving the comfort of people who never will. I sipped water, cool and dutiful, and reminded myself that tonight belonged to Mark and Jennifer. It was not about me. It could not be about me. And yet the air held a charge I knew too well. Years of gatherings have taught me to feel it before anyone else, like a barometer you can't turn off. Somewhere in this room was a moment waiting to be misused. Somewhere, a man with a microphone would remember that attention tastes like bourbon and burns less going down if it rides on someone else's humiliation. The appetizers arrived with a flourish. Prime rib to come, whispered the servers, horseradish cream waiting in porcelain like a minor dignitary. Napkins fluttered, ice chimed, laughter thickened into that polite roar 100 people produce when food finally gives them something to do with their hands. The pianist slid into something cheerful. A toddler attempted a jailbreak from a booster seat. Everything ordinary and lovely, the exact kind of scene you wish could last untouched. My father entered as though the door had been waiting for him specifically. Late, of course. He believes in the theater of delay, the way some men believe in God. His suit was a shade too shiny. His tie looked like an argument you could hear from the next room. He kissed my cheek in a way that felt like a press release and left the mint of his breath behind as evidence. "Don't cry," he said, as if emotion were mascara and my face were a thing that might fail me in public. He shouted greetings to no one in particular, created an audience where there had been none, drew a circle with his voice, and stepped into the center. I felt the first small hinge of the evening shift. At our table, conversation dimmed instinctively, the way birds quiet when a hawk passes overhead, though the sky is still blue. My hands remained folded on the linen. My spine found its practiced arrangement, tall enough to be steady, not so tall as to be seen as a challenge. The band's leader glanced toward the head table and then away, doing the math of what could be prevented and what could only be survived. "Family," a man across from me said softly, not to me, not to anyone, but to the bread plate in front of him, as if naming the element we were breathing. The word held both oxygen and smoke. I looked for Mark without turning my head. He was watching the bar, oblivious, eyes bright, confidence returning in the presence of his friends. Jennifer's father checked his cufflinks. Jennifer's mother smoothed the tablecloth with the flat of her palm. People place their hands on fabric when they want to smooth something they cannot control. It never works, but it gives the gesture a place to live. I have survived rooms like this by counting breaths, by finding anchors no one can take away, the cool curve of a water glass, the familiar worry of a ring, the clean weight of my mother's pearls against my collarbone. Tonight, I counted the seconds between the band's notes and the moment the microphone would scrape a butter knife. 10, 9, 8. The planner stood at the edge of the dance floor, her smile bright and purposeful, trying to shepherd the timeline back onto its rails. Her clipboard looked like a shield a child might bring into battle, brave and insufficient. I admired her anyway. Women save more evenings than anyone will ever count. The room turned its face toward the head table as if the light itself had pivoted. I knew what was coming the way you know rain by its smell before the first drop finds you. Knowing never stopped a storm. It only gives you enough time to decide whether to open your umbrella or close your eyes. Somewhere near the bar, a glass tapped. Once, twice, 3 times. The polite roar thinned. Laughter gathered its things and made for the exits. The moment stretched, the way moments do when they're about to choose their story. I straightened my napkin with careful fingers and placed it exactly where it had been. I have always believed in quiet professionalism. Do the hard thing. Speak softly. Get your people home. The doctrine holds in ballrooms as well as in dust. I lifted my chin and let my face become what it needed to be. Unreadable, steady, not auditioning for mercy. Across the room, one of the groomsmen, tall, left-handed, a face marked by a thin, healed line near the temple, shifted his stance almost imperceptibly. Another glanced toward him and then toward me. Not a question, not yet, more like an alignment. There is a choreography to intervention. It begins before anyone hears the music. My father cleared his throat. The microphone rose in his hand, a small black scepter offered to the worst part of him. I felt the temperature of the room drop 1/2 degree. I set my glass down without sound. Somewhere, a child laughed at something that wasn't funny. Somewhere else, someone decided to hold their breath. "Folks," my father began. My father's voice carried the way it always had, full of bravado, soaked in the confidence of a man who has never doubted his right to an audience. "Folks," he said again, smiling with the false warmth of someone who knows he has a sharp knife hidden behind his back, "I just want to say a word about family." I could have written the next lines before they left his mouth. He had delivered versions of this speech at graduations, funerals, even the opening of a new shop down on Main Street. He always started with a joke, because jokes gave him cover. If you objected, you couldn't take a joke. If you laughed, you became part of the cruelty. It was a performance polished over decades, and the ballroom was his stage now. He thanked the Hastings family for hosting the reception. He gestured to the chandeliers, to the food, and made a crack about fancy meals and too many forks, drawing polite chuckles from the tables. He was warming up, finding his rhythm. My stomach tightened, as if bracing for impact. I'd heard this song before, and I knew exactly when the chord would sour. And this, his hand swung wide, the spotlight following it until it landed squarely on me. His smirk widened, and my body froze in place. "This is my lazy, fat daughter." The words detonated in the air. Not everyone laughed, but enough. The kind of laughter that rolls like cheap liquor, quick and contagious, burning even as it goes down. Some guests pressed their lips together, uncomfortable, while others glanced around to see if it was safe to smile. Jennifer's mother made a soft, strangled sound, one hand flying to her necklace. Her father coughed into his fist. At my table, the couple from Wednesday golf looked suddenly fascinated with their salad plates. Heat bloomed in my cheeks, a hot flood that threatened to expose me if I moved even a muscle. For a moment, time slowed, thickened, as if the entire room had been dipped in molasses. I could hear the pianist's fingers falter on the keys. A waiter froze mid-pour, red wine trembling at the lip of a crystal glass. My son Mark's face went pale. He stared into his water goblet like it might explain how to be both a good son and a good man in the same moment. He was trapped, just like I had been for decades. I sat perfectly still, because I had learned long ago that if you don't move your face, sometimes time doesn't move either. My mother's pearls rested cool against my collarbone, anchoring me to a softer voice long gone. And then my father, sensing the attention wasn't thick enough yet, leaned into another story. "You all remember when she was 12, don't you?" he called, voice rising. "Little League fundraiser. 3 hot dogs gone in under 10 minutes. We laughed and laughed, called her the bottomless pit." The details were wrong. It had been my brother who had eaten 2 of those hot dogs, but truth had never been my father's priority. Performance was. Accuracy didn't matter if the room gave him the applause he craved. The laughter rippled again, hesitant this time, like a wave that didn't want to reach the shore but had been pushed forward anyway. My hands, folded on the linen, looked steady, but I saw them for what they were. Hands that had cleaned rifles, signed deployment orders, held dying men still enough to whisper comfort. Hands that had built a life for a son on nothing more than grit and quiet determination. The same hands that my father was trying to turn into a punchline. And then something shifted. Across the room, the groomsman straightened. Not all at once, not dramatically, just small adjustments, like men redistributing weight they knew they might need to carry. One with a scar near his temple murmured to the tall one wearing his watch on the wrong wrist. The tall one shook his head once, patience in the gesture, as if to say, "Not yet." But when my father chuckled and raised his glass for another blow, the scarred one's gaze found mine. It wasn't a request, not exactly. It was alignment. A silent question. Do we do this? I gave the smallest nod a person can give and still be seen. And in that moment, the night turned. The groomsmen set their glasses down in quiet unison. They didn't shout. They didn't salute. They simply said, in voices steady enough to slice the air clean through, "Sir, she's our commanding officer." The sentence landed like a hammer. The laughter died mid-breath. Guests froze, mouths open, eyes ricocheting between the young men and me. Even the chandeliers seemed to pause, as if light itself needed to reconsider where it was shining. My father blinked, confused, wineglass trembling in his hand. He tried to chuckle, then swallow, and did both badly. Red liquid sprayed across the tablecloth, a bright, ugly stain on the perfect white linen. For the first time in my life, the weight shifted. I was no longer the one exposed. He was. Silence expanded, thick and total, until the only sound left was the slow tick of a watch on a groomsman's wrong wrist. And I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I simply sat still, letting the truth hang heavy in the air, undeniable. My father's voice carried the way it always had, full of bravado, soaked in the confidence of a man who has never doubted his right to an audience. "Folks," he said again, smiling with the false warmth of someone who knows he has a sharp knife hidden behind his back. "I just want to say a word about family." I could have written the next lines before they left his mouth. He had delivered versions of this speech at graduations, funerals, even the opening of a new shop down on Main Street. He always started with a joke, because jokes gave him cover. If you objected, you couldn't take a joke. If you laughed, you became part of the cruelty. It was a performance polished over decades, and the ballroom was his stage now. He thanked the Hastings family for hosting the reception. He gestured to the chandeliers, to the food, and made a crack about fancy meals and too many forks, drawing polite chuckles from the tables. He was warming up, finding his rhythm. My stomach tightened as if bracing for impact. I'd heard this song before, and I knew exactly when the chord would sour. And this, his hand swung wide, the spotlight following it until it landed squarely on me. His smirk widened, and my body froze in place. "This is my lazy, fat daughter." The words detonated in the air. Not everyone laughed, but enough. The kind of laughter that rolls like cheap liquor, quick and contagious, burning even as it goes down. Some guests pressed their lips together, uncomfortable, while others glanced around to see if it was safe to smile. Jennifer's mother made a soft, strangled sound, one hand flying to her necklace. Her father coughed into his fist. At my table, the couple from Wednesday golf looked suddenly fascinated with their salad plates. Heat bloomed in my cheeks, a hot flood that threatened to expose me if I moved even a muscle. For a moment, time slowed, thickened, as if the entire room had been dipped in molasses. I could hear the pianist's fingers falter on the keys. A waiter froze mid-pour, red wine trembling at the lip of a crystal glass. My son Mark's face went pale. He stared into his water goblet like it might explain how to be both a good son and a good man in the same moment. He was trapped, just like I had been for decades. I sat perfectly still, because I had learned long ago that if you don't move your face, sometimes time doesn't move either. My mother's pearls rested cool against my collarbone, anchoring me to a softer voice long gone. And then my father, sensing the attention wasn't thick enough yet, leaned into another story. "You all remember when she was 12, don't you?" he called, voice rising. "Little League fundraiser. 3 hot dogs gone in under 10 minutes. We laughed and laughed, called her the bottomless pit." The details were wrong. It had been my brother who had eaten 2 of those hot dogs, but truth had never been my father's priority. Performance was. Accuracy didn't matter if the room gave him the applause he craved. The laughter rippled again, hesitant this time, like a wave that didn't want to reach the shore but had been pushed forward anyway. My hands, folded on the linen, looked steady, but I saw them for what they were: hands that had cleaned rifles, signed deployment orders, held dying men still enough to whisper comfort. Hands that had built a life for a son on nothing more than grit and quiet determination. The same hands that my father was trying to turn into a punchline. And then something shifted. Across the room, the groomsmen straightened. Not all at once, not dramatically, just small adjustments, like men redistributing weight they knew they might need to carry. One with a scar near his temple murmured to the tall one wearing his watch on the wrong wrist. The tall one shook his head once, patience in the gesture, as if to say, "Not yet." But when my father chuckled and raised his glass for another blow, the scarred one's gaze found mine. It wasn't a request, not exactly. It was alignment. A silent question. "Do we do this?" I gave the smallest nod a person can give and still be seen. And in that moment, the night turned. The groomsmen set their glasses down in quiet unison. They didn't shout. They didn't salute. They simply said, in voices steady enough to slice the air clean through, "Sir, she's our commanding officer." The sentence landed like a hammer. The laughter died mid-breath. Guests froze, mouths open, eyes ricocheting between the young men and me. Even the chandeliers seemed to pause, as if light itself needed to reconsider where it was shining. My father blinked, confused, wineglass trembling in his hand. He tried to chuckle, then swallow, and did both badly. Red liquid sprayed across the tablecloth, a bright, ugly stain on the perfect white linen. For the first time in my life, the weight shifted. I was no longer the one exposed. He was. Silence expanded, thick and total, until the only sound left was the slow tick of a watch on a groomsman's wrong wrist. And I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I simply sat still, letting the truth hang heavy in the air, undeniable. "Stop. Ban danoi. Continue ChatGPT danoi." The silence stretched so long it became a presence, pressing against everyone in the room. Even the chandeliers seemed to hum with it. My father's smirk wavered, then collapsed. He glanced from me to the men in tuxedos, his face flushing a blotchy red that spread up his neck. The tall groomsman, Miller, though only I knew his name, kept his voice calm, even respectful, but unyielding. "With respect, sir," he said, addressing the space where my father's authority had once been, "Colonel Merrick led us in Coast Province. You should speak of her accordingly." The word, colonel, moved through the ballroom like a current, hopping from ear to ear. A whisper at first, then louder, until I heard it on lips that had mocked me minutes earlier. Colonel. Not lazy, not fat. Colonel. Jennifer's father, a man who measured everything in contracts and connections, adjusted his tie as if the respect he owed me were suddenly too tight at his throat. Her mother blinked rapidly, her hand still fixed to her necklace as though it were rosary beads. Even Jennifer herself, polished and composed, stared at me with something that looked startlingly like awe. My son Mark stood abruptly, his chair legs scraped against the parquet floor with a jarring screech. He looked from me to the men, then back again, as if piecing together a puzzle he'd never been given all the pieces to. His lips parted, but no words came. He didn't need to say anything. His eyes, my mother's eyes, spoke enough. My father swallowed hard. "Just a joke," he muttered, aiming for hearty but hitting hollow. His attempt at laughter rattled and broke. "Can't anybody here take a joke?" "Not that kind," said the scarred groomsman quietly. His voice was steady, but his jaw tightened as though holding back the memory of sand, gunfire, and the taste of copper in the air. "We don't joke about the people who get us home alive." The room exhaled all at once, as though a collective truth had been set free. I didn't move. Years of command had taught me that silence, when wielded correctly, was more powerful than any speech. My face remained unreadable, but inside I felt a slow, almost imperceptible click, like a lock disengaging. For decades, I had been the punchline. Tonight, I had become the reckoning. The Hastings family shifted in their seats, recalculating the story they would tell about me tomorrow. Not the plain, practical mother of the groom, not the daughter who endured her father's barbs in silence. No, now I was someone else entirely, someone they hadn't accounted for in their carefully balanced equations of class and status. The planner hovered near the edge of the room, her clipboard clutched to her chest. Her smile was brittle, but her eyes were wide with something close to admiration. She whispered to the band to play something, anything, but the musicians sat frozen, their instruments hushed. No music could paper over what had been revealed. My father dabbed furiously at the wine stain on his lapel as though it were the real problem, not the decades of cruelty that had just been exposed. His hand trembled. For the first time, I saw him small, not because I had shrunk myself for his comfort, but because the room had seen through him. The armor he wore, built of mockery and dominance, was suddenly paper-thin. And then Miller, still standing tall and calm, added one final blow, not cruel, but true. "Sir, you don't have to like us, but you will respect her." The words landed heavier than the insult ever had, because they weren't shouted. They weren't angry. They were simply true, and truth weighs more than arrogance can carry. I caught Miller's eye. No salute passed between us, no overt display. Just a look that said, "We've got your six, always." And for the first time in decades, I didn't feel alone in my own family. I reached for my washer glass, lifted it to my lips, and drank slowly. Steady. Controlled. Let them all look. Let them all recalculate their stories. I didn't need to explain myself. The truth had already spoken on my behalf. My father set his napkin down with a sharp slap, as if to reclaim authority by noise alone. But authority, once lost, doesn't return on command. It relocates quietly, absolutely. And in that chandeliered ballroom, on the night my son married into money and I expected only to endure, the authority shifted, for the first time, from the man who mocked me to the woman he had mocked. I stayed still. I didn't gloat. I didn't strike back. I let the silence finish the work my soldiers had started, because sometimes the most powerful victory is simply refusing to play the fool again. The silence was still trembling in the air when the wedding planner, brave as any soldier I'd ever known, stepped forward with a clipboard clutched like a shield. Her voice, practiced and professional, sliced through the stillness. "Let's raise a glass to the newlyweds," she announced, her tone bright, urgent. "To Mark and Jennifer." It was a lifeline tossed into turbulent waters. Guests seized it greedily, lifting their glasses, murmuring toasts. But the rhythm of celebration was broken, the easy laughter gone. The toast landed hollow, more ritual than joy. I remained seated, my hand steady on the stem of my glass. For years, I had dreamed of moments like this, of saying everything I'd swallowed in parking lots, kitchens, and pews. But when the moment arrived, I found that vengeance felt smaller than I had imagined. It couldn't compete with the gravity of silence, with the truth already laid bare. My father, desperate to regain ground, cleared his throat. "It was a joke," he insisted louder this time, his tone pleading. "I was just fooling around. Don't take it so seriously." His words fell flat. Miller's voice cut through, not harsh, not mocking, but certain. "Sir, respect isn't a joke." Gasps fluttered across the tables. Some heads turned toward me, waiting for my reaction. Others glanced nervously at my father, as though wondering if the old man had another barb ready to throw. He didn't. He stared at his lap, the stain of spilled wine spreading like evidence he couldn't cover up. Jennifer's father finally spoke, breaking the awkwardness with a carefully measured voice. "Colonel Merrick," he said, nodding in my direction, "thank you for your service." His words, stiff as a legal contract, were still an acknowledgement. It was the first bridge between his family's wealth and the truth he couldn't ignore. Jennifer looked from him to me, her face unreadable, then leaned close to Mark. "Why didn't you tell us?" she whispered, not realizing I could hear her. "Because it wasn't my story to tell," Mark said softly. His voice carried more pride than I'd ever heard in it before. The room shifted again, small murmurs carrying my name and rank, from table to table like sparks. Colonel, Army, Afghanistan, convoy. Words reshaping me in their minds, words I had kept locked away from this family for decades. I felt my son's eyes on me. There was no judgment there, no confusion, only awe and a new understanding that was almost painful in its intensity. He had known me as his mother, the one who packed lunches and balanced bills. Now, in front of his in-laws and 200 guests, he was seeing me as something else, something larger. The planner returned to my side, her smile brittle, but her tone composed. "Would you like to give a toast?" she asked quietly, as if the microphone itself were a dangerous object that only I could wield safely. The weight of the room pressed in. Every face turned toward me, waiting to see if I would rise, if I would slash back with the sharpness of all the years I had been cut. My father hunched over his plate, his hands trembling against the linen. He didn't look up. He knew this was the moment I could destroy him. I stood slowly. The scrape of my chair legs echoed across the parquet floor. I walked toward the microphone with measured steps, each one deliberate, my heels clicking in rhythm like a drumbeat. The microphone felt warm beneath my fingers. I adjusted it with the calm precision of a woman who had briefed platoons before battle. I looked first to the groomsmen, my soldiers, my quiet defenders. "Thank you," I said simply. Gratitude was the right flag to raise. Then I turned to the room, my voice low but strong. "I'm not here to correct anyone's biography," I began. "I'm here to celebrate two people who chose each other. Marriage isn't about perfection. It's about honor in close quarters, about telling the truth when it would be easier not to, about showing respect, especially when it's hardest." I let the words settle, watching them land. My gaze swept across the tables but didn't stop on my father. Mercy, I'd learned, doesn't audition. I lifted my glass toward Mark and Jennifer. Here's to two good people who will spend their lives getting each other home. The room rose with me. Glasses lifted, the applause that followed was real, unhesitating, cleansing. The Hastings family clapped. Their expressions softened into something like humility. My son's eyes shone, full of pride, and something else, love that had grown deeper in a single evening. Only one person remained seated, my father. He didn't clap. He didn't smile. He stared at his plate as though the grain of the wood might save him. But he also didn't speak. And in our family, that silence was progress. I lowered my glass and returned to my seat, my heart steady. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the one shrinking in the shadow of his voice. I had spoken, not for revenge, but for truth. And the room had listened. The applause faded. The silence that followed lingered, not heavy now, but reverent. Something had shifted permanently. I had stopped auditioning. I had claimed my name. And my father would never introduce me the same way again. The band tried to recover, easing into a safe, cheerful melody. But the notes rang thin, like someone trying to whistle in a graveyard. Guests shifted in their seats, their conversations brittle at first, then slowly picking up, though the laughter never regained its earlier ease. Laughter, once broken, doesn't grow back quickly. Mark leaned across Jennifer to catch my eye. He mouthed, "Thank you." His shoulders relaxed for the first time all night, and I felt the weight of years slide from mine. My son had seen me, not just the mother who folded laundry and worked late to keep the lights on, but the woman who had carried weight heavier than any joke could ever pin to me. At our table, Miller and the other groomsmen melted back into the background, their glasses refilled, their posture casual again. But their presence was no longer invisible. Every guest who glanced their way knew what had happened, knew who they had defended. They weren't just friends of the groom, they were witnesses, men who had carried truth across continents and delivered it here, in a chandeliered ballroom. Jennifer's mother dabbed delicately at her mouth with her napkin. Her face was carefully composed, but her eyes kept flicking toward me, as though recalculating. I caught a sliver of respect there, reluctant but real. Her father still fiddled with his cufflinks, his discomfort plain. Wealth gives you many tools, but not the one you need when confronted with integrity you didn't expect. Across the room, my father sat hunched, the stain on his shirt front spreading. He rubbed furiously at it with his napkin, muttering under his breath, as though the wine were the crime, not the words he'd spoken. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him. For decades, he'd filled rooms with his voice, shrinking me down with each cutting remark. But now the room had seen him, truly seen him, and the measure had shifted. Dinner service resumed, waiters whisking plates across the floor with professional grace. But the rhythm was off. Forks moved, conversations buzzed, yet the undercurrent of what had been revealed clung to the air. When the best man rose to give his speech, his jokes about married life landed flat. He stumbled, skipped half his notes, and sat down quickly. The maid of honor wept halfway through hers, and no one minded. Tears were safer than laughter now. Then the microphone came back to me. I hadn't planned to speak again. But silence, I knew, could become complicity, and I had lived too many years carrying silence like a stone. I stood once more, slower this time. The ballroom quieted, the hush almost grateful. I wasn't planning to give another toast, I began, my voice steady. A ripple of soft, relieved laughter moved through the guests. Not cruel this time, just human. But life doesn't always follow the plan. I looked at Mark and Jennifer. Marriage isn't about perfection. It's about honor when you live in close quarters, about telling the truth when it would be easier not to, about respect, even when it costs you something. I raised my glass again. So, here's to Mark and Jennifer. May you always honor each other, not in the easy moments, but in the hard ones. This time the applause thundered, unhesitating, unforced. Guests stood, glasses clinking, relief flooding the room like fresh air. For the first time that night, I felt applause land on me, not as spectacle, but as respect. My father didn't clap. His jaw worked, his hands clenched on the tablecloth, but he didn't speak either. And in our family, that silence was no small victory. The orchestra shifted into a waltz, and the newlyweds moved to the dance floor. Guests followed, tentative at first, then more assured, eager to re-inhabit normalcy. But the shape of the night had changed, and everyone knew it. I drifted toward the edge of the room, the shadows where I usually kept myself. A woman I didn't know brushed my arm as she passed. "Thank you for your service," she whispered. Her eyes shone, not with gossip, but with gratitude. I nodded once. Praise still felt strange, like a coat that didn't quite fit, but I let it settle on me. I had worn worse things in silence. At the head table, my father stared into his plate as though it might give him back his authority. But power had already moved. It doesn't shout when it relocates, it simply leaves. And for the first time, I didn't follow him into the shadows he cast. I let him sit there, alone, in the silence he had made. The dance floor filled slowly, cautiously, as though guests were testing whether the evening could bear joy again. Jennifer's gown trailed across the parquet in soft arcs as Mark spun her, his hand steady now, his smile unburdened. Around them, cousins clapped, uncles shuffled awkwardly to the beat, and children darted between skirts and polished shoes like minnows in shallow water. I stood back, near the edge of the room where the chandeliers dimmed into softer light, my pearls pressed cool against my collarbone, a steady reminder of my mother's quiet strength. I could almost feel her presence, her hand on my shoulder, the way she used to steady me when I was too young to understand that endurance is its own kind of armor. A waiter passed with a tray of champagne flutes, and I took one, not because I craved the taste, but because holding something anchored me. The glass felt light, almost fragile, compared to the weight of the moment still settling in the air. Across the room, Miller and the other groomsmen stood together, laughing now in low tones, their posture finally relaxed. But every so often, one of them glanced my way, offering a small nod, a silent promise. "We've got your back." That bond, forged years ago in sand and fire, had traveled all the way to this ballroom, cutting through the decades of silence my father had layered on me. Jennifer's mother approached, her heels clicking against the polished floor, her smile tighter than her words. "You never mentioned your career," she said, her voice carefully measured, balancing between admiration and reproach. "It wasn't the story being told," I replied simply. Her eyes flickered, searching for a place to land. At last she inclined her head, a small concession. "Well," she murmured, "thank you for what you've done." And then she was gone, retreating back to her circle of relatives. Mark and Jennifer swayed together, laughter spilling between them. My son caught my eye again and mouthed, "I love you." I pressed my hand to my heart, answering without words. Some truths didn't need a microphone. At our table, my father sat slumped, his napkin discarded like a white flag he didn't know how to wave. He cut his beef into precise squares, each bite chewed with the stubbornness of a man who refused to admit he was already defeated. Every so often, he glanced up, as if searching for an ally, but found only polite avoidance. The audience he had counted on had left him, not in body, but in spirit. The maid of honor rose for her toast, her hands trembling, her mascara streaked. "To Jennifer and Mark," she choked, tears spilling freely. "May you always be each other's safe place." Her words rang truer than she knew. The applause was gentle, forgiving. Then, unplanned, a cousin of Jennifer's, a girl barely 20, bold with champagne, blurted, "Is it true? Were you really over there?" Her wide eyes locked on me, filled with curiosity rather than cruelty. I set my glass down and answered with the simplest truth. "Yes," I said, "and so were many better than me." Her cheeks flushed. She sat back, chastened. Sometimes humility cuts sharper than pride. The evening pressed on, the orchestra shifting into brighter songs, the chatter rising, but a layer of reverence remained, like dust on polished wood. People approached me, one by one, some offering gratitude, others asking careful questions, a few just wanting to shake my hand. I gave what I could, withheld what I must. The ribbons on my uniform told stories I had no intention of unpacking here, under chandeliers and scrutiny. When the cake was cut and champagne poured again, I stepped outside for air. The night was cool, the country club lawns stretching in manicured perfection beneath the stars. I breathed deeply, the crispness filling my lungs like absolution. From inside, faint music drifted out, muffled by heavy doors. For a moment, I allowed myself to imagine what my mother would say if she stood beside me. "You did well," I heard in the silence. "You didn't have to shout. You didn't have to prove anything. You just had to stand." Behind me, the doors opened and Mark slipped out, jacket off, tie askew. He stood beside me, his breath clouding in the cool air. "Mom," he said, his voice low, careful, "why didn't you ever tell me?" I kept my eyes on the horizon. "Because it wasn't about me," I said. "It was about raising you, making sure you knew who you were, not who I was." He was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "Well, tonight, I finally saw you." His throat worked, his eyes shining. "And I've never been prouder to be your son." I swallowed hard, my hand finding his. That's all I ever wanted. Inside, the music swelled, a saxophone carrying the melody. The world would move forward. But something fundamental had shifted. I was no longer invisible in my own family story. And my father, still inside, would never be able to rewrite me again. The night wound on, but the edges of it never softened the way weddings usually do. People danced, yes, but their eyes flicked back toward me more often than toward the bride and groom. I hadn't asked for that spotlight, and I didn't particularly want it. But once truth stands in the middle of a room, it doesn't easily sit down again. I returned to my table, only to find my father gone. His chair sat pulled out awkwardly, his wineglass tipped slightly, as though he'd left mid-thought. No explanation, no goodbye, just absence. The kind of exit he specialized in, leaving me to pick up the pieces of silence. Jennifer's grandmother leaned toward me as I sat down. Her brooch glittered like a captured galaxy under the chandelier. "My dear," she whispered, her voice papery, fragile but firm, "you carried yourself with dignity tonight. That's rarer than diamonds in families like ours." She patted my hand once, then turned back to her dessert, as if the matter was settled. I stared at my untouched plate, the fork resting diagonally across porcelain. Appetite was a stranger now. I had fed myself on endurance for decades. Food was secondary. The orchestra launched into a swing number, and cousins tugged reluctant aunts onto the dance floor. Mark and Jennifer twirled, glowing, wrapped in their own orbit. For all the wreckage my father had attempted, their joy remained intact. That was the victory I cherished most. Later, when the photographer gathered people for family portraits, I stood dutifully at Mark's side. Jennifer's smile pressed bright and perfect between us. The flashbulb froze us in time. 3 generations framed together, though one had chosen absence. My father was nowhere in the picture. Perhaps for the first time, that absence felt more like a gift than a wound. As the night waned, I stepped outside again. The country club's manicured lawns stretched out beneath the moonlight, the kind of perfection you can't breathe in for too long without choking. Crickets pulsed their steady rhythm. The air smelled faintly of lavender from beds lining the walk. I slipped my shoes off and let the cool grass press against my feet. A small rebellion, private and silent. For so many years, I had followed rules that made me smaller. Tonight, barefoot in borrowed moonlight, I let myself expand just enough to feel the earth. Behind me, the heavy doors opened again. Miller emerged, jacket unbuttoned, tie loosened, the weariness of too many wars lingering in his posture. He didn't speak at first. He just stood beside me, his presence steady as it had been in 1,000 harder nights. Finally, he said, "Ma'am, I hope you know, we'd follow you anywhere. Still would." I smiled faintly, eyes fixed on the horizon. "I know, and that's why I don't need to ask." He nodded once, a soldier's bow, then returned inside. No further ceremony, just truth, exchanged quietly under the stars. When I came back in, the party had thinned. The older guests had slipped away. coats over their arms, murmuring about long drives home. The young ones clustered at the bar, their laughter braver now, fueled by champagne and relief. Jennifer's father shook hands at the door, playing host with renewed vigor, though his glances toward me still carried something unsettled. Mark caught me near the coat room. "Mom," he said softly, "thank you for tonight, for everything." I touched his cheek, my hand memorizing the shape of the man who had once been a boy with scraped knees and questions I couldn't always answer. "It was always about you, Mark, about giving you a life bigger than the shadows I grew up in." His eyes glistened. "You did. You gave me more than I'll ever be able to say." I kissed his forehead. "Then make sure you give the same to her," I whispered, nodding toward Jennifer, who stood radiant even in her exhaustion. By the time the last song played, the ballroom had softened into something almost tender. The chandeliers still glittered, the roses in their vases still held their shape, but the night's sharp edges had dulled into quiet reflection. I gathered my wrap, slipping it over my shoulders. As I turned to leave, I glanced back at the room. For once, I wasn't leaving as the invisible one, the afterthought, the shadow. I was leaving as myself. Outside, the cool night met me like an embrace. The sky was wide, the stars sharp. My car waited in the lot, modest among the polished chrome of luxury vehicles. I didn't care. Respect doesn't drive a brand. It walks on its own feet, steady, measured, earned. And tonight, for the first time in decades, I walked out taller. The next morning, the house was quiet. Too quiet. Weddings always leave echoes, flowers wilting in vases, programs forgotten on counters, shoes kicked off by the door. I stood in my kitchen with a mug of coffee and stared at the line of arrangements Mark and Jennifer had sent home with me. Lilies, roses, hydrangeas, every bloom bowed under its own weight, like guests who had stayed up too late. My phone lit with messages, old friends from town who had been at the reception. Some said proud of you. Others said sorry about your dad. A few asked bluntly, did that really happen? I flipped the phone face down on the counter. The truth didn't need my replies. At 9, Mark called. His voice was sanded down by fatigue, but laced with happiness. "We're driving up to the lake. Jen's folks rented a cabin for a few days. You okay?" "I am," I said, and for once it was true. There was a pause. "Mom, last night, what you said. Thank you. You could have..." He hesitated, then laughed quietly. "You could have burned the whole place down." I smiled into my coffee. Sometimes you don't need fire. Sometimes silence burns hotter. "Yeah," he said softly. "Well, I've never been prouder to be your son." His voice cracked, just a little. "I love you." "I love you too, Mark. Go enjoy your wife. That's your only mission now." When the call ended, I stood at the window and watched a sparrow chase a larger bird off the feeder. The sparrow won. Size has always been a poor predictor of victory. By noon, the gossip had already reached the diner. When I stopped in for a BLT, the waitress added an extra slice of bacon without a word. At the hardware store, an old man who usually avoided eye contact paused at the end of an aisle. He cleared his throat and said, "Ma'am," with a nod. It was a greeting, weighted with recognition, almost reverence. But my father didn't call. Not that day, not the next. On the third morning, I laced my shoes and walked to his shop. The roll-up door was half open, the air thick with oil and dust. A country song hummed low from the radio, embarrassed by its own sentiment. He sat at the workbench, pencil in hand, brow furrowed over a ledger. He didn't look up when I entered. "You're open?" I asked. "Always," he said flatly. I set a socket set on the bench. "You loaned me this. I marked the ones that were yours." He grunted, a wordless thank you in his native tongue. "I thought we should talk," I said. "We talked enough Saturday," he muttered, still bent over the ledger. "No," I said firmly. "You talked. Then other people did. I'd like to speak now." He set the pencil down with exaggerated care, like laying down a fuse. "If this is about your big moment..." "It's about the little ones," I cut in. My voice sharpened. "The parking lots, the church steps, the dinners where you called me big girl in front of neighbors. It wasn't just Saturday, Dad. It was a lifetime." He flinched, not because he didn't remember, but because he did. Silence pulled tight between us, the kind that holds like old rope. "It was a joke," he said finally weakly. "Jokes are supposed to be funny to the person who hears them," I answered, "not just the person who tells them." He rubbed his jaw as though the words had landed like a punch. People laughed, he muttered. And then they didn't, I said. That's the part you need to remember. His eyes shifted toward the radio, searching for an easier song to hide inside. None came. You never said what you do, he tried again. You never told me. You never asked, I replied. You filled the blanks with the story you preferred. He sniffed. Military's just a job. So is fatherhood, I shot back. The words hit their mark. He looked older suddenly, smaller in his own shop. I gave you what I had, he muttered. You gave me the parts of you that mocked what you couldn't control, I said quietly. You withheld the part that names what is good and leaves it alone. His fingers drummed once, twice against the wood. Then he asked, almost like a child, So what do you want? An apology? I want you to stop, I said. My voice didn't rise, but it hardened. Not just the big performances, the small cuts too. Stop buying power with my dignity. If you can't, then we'll see each other less. And I won't bring Mark around either. I won't let you hand him the same blade you've been swinging at me my whole life. He stared at me, and for a flicker of a moment, I saw the man he had been when I was 5 years old, letting me hand him wrenches and naming them like treasures. Phillips, Flathead, Crescent. Back then, he had treated language like a toolbox. Somewhere along the way, he'd turned it into a weapon. Now he looked tired, slumped, stripped of his stage lights. What if I can't stop, he asked. Not a dare, not defiance, a confession. Then we see each other less, I said evenly. But if you can try, if you can even begin, then maybe we start again. Beginning isn't erasing, Dad, it's choosing better. He dropped his gaze to the ledger again, but his hand shook just slightly. Progress sometimes sounds like subtraction. Sometimes it sounds like the quiet after a truth that can't be taken back. He closed the ledger slowly, as if the act itself cost him something. The pencil rolled off the bench and clattered to the floor, but neither of us reached for it. He sat there hunched, his hands knotted together, the tough skin of his knuckles gone pale. For a long time, the only sound was the low rattle of a box fan, ticking every fifth rotation. Finally, his voice came, softer than I'd ever heard it. I've been mean my whole life. I didn't let the words wash over me like an apology. They weren't. They were a statement, a truth he'd carried too long. You've been afraid, I said quietly. Mean is just how afraid dresses for work. He looked up sharply, like the words had reached a nerve he didn't know was exposed. His mouth opened, then closed again. No rebuttal, no joke. Just the weight of hearing himself named in a way he couldn't dismiss. You going to fix me now? He asked, bitterness flickering at the edges. I can't, I said. I can only draw the line. You're the one who has to step over it. The fan rattled again, shaking dust into the air. He pressed the heel of his hand into his forehead and muttered, You got hard. I got clear, I corrected. He studied me then, his eyes narrowing, not with anger, but with something close to recognition. For the first time, I think he saw me as a grown woman, not just a daughter locked in the amber of his old judgments. He thumbed the edge of the ledger paper once, twice, then pushed it aside. His voice was hesitant, almost clumsy. There's a service Saturday at the Veterans Memorial. They're dedicating a new plaque. I could stand there with you. I almost refused. Pride and resentment lined up in me, sharp as bayonets. But then I heard my mother's voice in the quieter corners of myself, the part she had left behind. If he reaches, let him touch the air at least. I nodded once. Okay. The words startled him more than if I had shouted. He nodded too, brusque, as though sealing a deal he didn't entirely trust himself to keep. Saturday arrived bright in that Ohio way, where the sky tries to apologize for the winters. The memorial stood in its neat square of grass between the library and the post office. Rows of names carved into granite glistened under the sun. A handful of townspeople gathered. Boy Scouts in their sashes, a retired teacher with a flag pin, a nurse still in her scrubs holding a toddler on her hip. The mayor spoke, his words official, predictable. Then a Marine in dress blues saluted the plaque with a trembling hand. Silence followed, thick and reverent. We stood near the back. My father had shaved. His tie was quiet, subdued. He didn't talk. He didn't put a hand on my arm like he was steering me somewhere I didn't want to go. He just stood next to me, as if proximity itself was a new sentence he was learning to pronounce. Men came to shake my hand after the ceremony, a few recognizing my name from local headlines, others just honoring the uniform they had seen me wear once or twice on the news. My father didn't interrupt. He didn't diminish me with a chuckle or translate me into smaller words. He let me stand. On the walk back to his truck, he broke the silence. "I've been afraid," he said, his voice rough. "Mean is easier." "You can still choose different," I replied. He gave a short grunt, almost a laugh, but not unkind. "You going to fix me now?" "I can't fix you," I said again, "but I can refuse to stand where I'm not respected." We reached the tailgate and stood there, two people orbiting the same history, unsure if it would hold. He glanced at my hands. His voice was small, unsteady. "Those rings, I don't know what any of them mean." I looked down at the metal bands that had marked deployments, battles, survival. "Each one is a story," I told him. "Not one of them is a joke." He nodded once, a tiny bow to a country he had never visited but could finally recognize on a map. A week later, he showed up at my house at dusk with a grocery sack full of tomatoes from someone's garden. He set them on the counter and said, "You got any salt?" It was such a small thing. But contrition doesn't always arrive with trumpets. Sometimes it shows up in a paper bag, resting on your kitchen counter. We ate them standing up, salt and juice dripping down our hands. He told me the price of copper, how the new kid at the shop over-tightened a valve and learned humility the honest way. I told him about the sparrow that had bullied the blue jay off the feeder. "Huh," he said. "Just that. As if the world had handed us a metaphor we didn't need to stretch into meaning." He didn't say he was proud. That word may never live comfortably in his mouth. But when he left, he eased the screen door closed so it wouldn't slam. Consideration is its own dialect. I'll take it. Sunday morning, the same pew held us both, sunlight pouring through the wheat and water-stained glass. It painted our shoulders in amber and blue, the way it always had. The service ended, the benediction offered, and we walked out into the parking lot where humiliation had so often made its home. A man from my father's bowling league called out, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Heard your girl gave a speech at that fancy shindig?" For a heartbeat, I braced myself, every muscle taut, expecting the familiar punchline. My father could still choose the old script. He could still cut me down in front of witnesses. But he didn't. He lifted his chin, glanced at me, then back at the man. "She didn't give a speech," he said. "She gave a standard." The words dropped into the air like coins into a well, ringing all the way down. He didn't look at me when he said it. He didn't need to. For the first time, he had chosen respect over ridicule. I carried that moment with me the rest of the day. Respect may arrive late, but it still arrives. That afternoon, I checked the mail. Inside was a card addressed in Jennifer's neat, lawyerly handwriting. "Thank you for not making me the villain," it read. "Even when it would have been easy. I'm learning." Tucked inside was a photograph the wedding photographer had taken, a candid shot of me raising my glass during the toast. The light had caught me in a way that wasn't a spotlight, but a window. I set the photo on the bookshelf beside one of my mother holding me at 6 months old. Both of us serious. Both of us practicing how to be seen without asking permission. The house was quiet that evening, soft at its edges. I brewed tea, sat at the kitchen table, and let the silence settle without fighting it. For once, it wasn't heavy. It was peace. There would be more conversations with my father, more lines to draw, more days when tomatoes and paper bags would be contrition in disguise, more Saturdays when we stood near granite walls and let names teach us how not to waste our own. But something had changed permanently. A truth had been spoken aloud in a room full of witnesses, and once a truth hears itself, it doesn't stop speaking. I didn't need a new father. I needed the old one to stop using me as kindling. And slowly he was learning. By August, the story of that wedding night had wound its way through every diner booth and grocery aisle in town. At the diner, people asked me about the groomsman, not about my weight. At church, nobody called me big girl anymore. They called me by my name. Respect had finally found me, years late, but still mine to claim. My father stayed quiet for weeks after the memorial. We orbited each other carefully, like veterans circling a battlefield they weren't ready to discuss. I'd see his truck parked outside the hardware store, or his figure hunched over a cart in the grocery aisle. He didn't approach, and I didn't force it. The breakthrough came at a cookout in my brother's backyard. Men clustered around the grill, swapping the same stories they always did. My father wandered over with a plate of chicken wings, set it down, and looked at me. "This is my daughter," he said. The words were simple, ordinary, but his voice held no smirk, no bite. For once, there was no joke trailing behind. "She runs things bigger than this grill," he added, clearing his throat. "She takes care of people, that's all I'll say." The men nodded, accepting. No laughter, just acknowledgement. Later that night, he stopped by my porch with a jar of pickles from a neighbor's garden. Figured you might like these, he muttered. It wasn't an apology, but it was something. We sat in rocking chairs, not filling the silence with barbs or defenses, just sitting. Sometimes reconciliation doesn't sound like trumpets. Sometimes it sounds like two people agreeing not to sharpen knives anymore. I don't tell this story to humiliate my father. I tell it because even rocky soil can grow something if you stop salting it with cruelty. He was raised in a world where men measured worth with waistlines and wallets. He handed me that yardstick because it was the only one he had. But that doesn't excuse the damage. Words are hammers. They can build or they can shatter. The lesson is simple. Respect your children, especially when they don't look like the picture you imagined. The body you mock might be carrying a pack through mountains. The quiet child you dismiss might be leading others in storms you'll never see. Maybe you're a parent. Maybe you're a grandparent. Maybe you're someone still hearing the echo of a cruel sentence from long ago. Remember this. What you say in public can wound for decades, or it can heal in an instant. You get to choose. As for me, I no longer wait for my father to announce my worth. I carry it myself. I live it in the way I stand when the lights hit me. Still, I'll admit, he's trying. He calls me by my name more now. Sometimes he even smiles. And that, too, is a kind of victory. Weeks slipped by, and the story of that night at the Hastings ballroom became less of an incident and more of a parable around town. People retold it in barbershops and grocery aisles, always trimming or embellishing the details. Some swore the groomsman had snapped to attention in a perfect line. Others claimed my father nearly choked on his wine. The truth was simpler, but I didn't bother correcting them. Let the story work however it needed to. At the diner, strangers nodded at me with a respect I hadn't felt since coming home from deployments. They didn't know the details of medals or missions, just that I had carried something hard and it deserved acknowledgement. At church, the old nickname disappeared. Nobody called me Big Girl anymore. They called me Cassia, and that was enough. My father and I moved cautiously around each other, as if we were both veterans circling the same crater, neither quite ready to step into it. There were no grand reconciliations, no tearful apologies, just smaller shifts, his voice quieter when he spoke to me, his eyes less sharp when they landed on my son. One Sunday afternoon, my brother hosted a cookout. The grill smoked. Men clustered around it, swapping the same tired jokes they'd recycled for years. My father approached, balancing a plate piled high with wings. He set it down, cleared his throat, and gestured toward me. "This is my daughter," he said simply. The men turned, waiting for the punchline that usually followed, but none came. He just stood there, hands in his pockets, his gaze steady. "She runs things bigger than this grill. She takes care of people. That's all I'll say." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was respect, settling in like a new kind of weather. Later that evening, he stopped by my porch with a jar of pickles from a neighbor's garden. "Figured you might like these," he muttered. He handed them over like a peace offering, awkward and genuine. We sat in rocking chairs, the cicadas buzzing in the dusk, neither of us rushing to fill the quiet. Sometimes reconciliation doesn't sound like speeches or apologies. Sometimes it sounds like two people agreeing not to sharpen their knives anymore. I thought of my mother often in those weeks, the way she had tried to patch his cruelty with casseroles and soft words, as if kindness alone could erase the bruises of humiliation. She hadn't lived long enough to see this softer version of him, and maybe that was a mercy, or maybe it was a tragedy. I kept her pearls on the dresser, worn smooth from years of being my private armor. Every time I clasped them around my neck, I remembered that she had loved me out loud while he cut me down in public, and somehow both voices had shaped me. But now, at last, mine was the voice that carried. One evening, as August settled heavy on the town, my father joined me at another family gathering. The men lingered near the grill again, drinks in hand, while the women cleared plates and wiped tables. I expected him to drift toward the usual audience, to fill the air with old stories polished into weapons. Instead, he approached me where I stood under the maple tree, the lantern light casting his face in tired lines. He looked at me for a long moment, his jaw working, and then he said quietly, "You were right. I've been afraid my whole life." I didn't rush to answer. Some truths deserve their own silence before you meet them. Finally, I nodded. "Fear doesn't excuse cruelty, Dad, but admitting it, that's a start." He exhaled, long and shaky. "I can't promise I'll get it right all the time, Neither can I said. But respect isn't about perfection. It's about choosing better, especially when it's hard. His shoulders slumped, as though a weight he'd carried for years had finally slipped. For once, he didn't reach for a joke, or a smirk, or a barb. He just stood there, stripped of the armor of mockery, a man finally trying. And that, I realized, was enough. The moral isn't complicated. Words are hammers. They can build or they can shatter. My father had shattered me for decades, but in one chandeliered ballroom, the truth had been spoken, and it began to build something new. I tell this story not to drag him through the dirt, but to remind anyone listening, the child you mock today might be the one who saves lives tomorrow. The quiet daughter you dismiss might be leading soldiers when the world is burning. Respect your children, especially when they don't fit the picture you imagined. As for me, I don't wait for my father's approval anymore. I carry my own. Still, I'll admit, he tries now. He calls me by my name. Sometimes he even smiles. And after all those years, that too is a kind of victory. By the time summer bent into late August, the story of the Hastings wedding had already traveled farther than I ever intended. At the farmer's market, people whispered when I walked past the stalls of peaches and corn. At the library, a clerk I'd known since childhood pressed my hand over the counter and said, "I'm glad they finally saw you." Even at the gas station, strangers nodded as if I carried some quiet banner only they could read. It was strange, after so many years of invisibility, to feel my own name circulate through the air without ridicule attached. Respect had finally caught up to me, late, weathered, imperfect, but real. My father, meanwhile, grew quieter, not silent, not absent, just careful. I noticed it first in the way he paused before speaking, as though testing his words against some new standard. At first, the pauses were clumsy, obvious, but gradually they became something else, restraint. We still clashed. Old habits don't die clean. But his sharpness dulled, his jokes lost their poison. He asked about Mark without the sideways jabs. He even asked about Jennifer, her job, her family, tentative, genuine. One evening, he stopped by with a grocery sack of late summer cucumbers. "Pickled these myself," he muttered, setting the jar on my counter. The brine was too strong, the lids not sealed quite right, but I ate them anyway. Sometimes contrition tastes like vinegar, and you learn to appreciate it. A few weeks later, another family cookout. My brother manned the grill, smoke curling into the humid air. Children shrieked in the yard, chasing each other with sparklers. I stood on the porch with a glass of iced tea, content to let the laughter carry. My father joined the circle of men by the grill. I braced, expecting the usual rhythm of boasts and barbs, but then I heard his voice, steady, sure. "This is my daughter," he said, gesturing toward me. The men turned, waiting for the punchline that never came. "She's tougher than any of us," he added simply. "That's all you need to know." No laughter followed, just nods. And in that moment, the yard felt different, the air lighter. Later that night, he walked me to my car. He cleared his throat as if something heavy had caught there. "You know," he said slowly, "I used to think strength was about who could shout the loudest." He shook his head. "Turns out I was wrong." I didn't press him. Some admissions are fragile. You hold them gently, or they break. Instead, I touched his arm. "Turns out you're learning." He nodded once, looking away, but I saw the corner of his mouth soften. I don't tell this story to glorify him or to erase the decades of damage. I tell it because change, even late, is still change. Because words, once spoken, can't be unsaid, but new words can be chosen. If you're a parent, remember this. The weight of your words will outlive you. They can break your child into silence, or they can build a foundation strong enough for them to stand on when the world turns against them. And if you're a child still carrying the echo of a cruel sentence from years ago, know this: you are not defined by the laughter of the room. You are defined by the truth that eventually rises beside you, steady and unshakable. My father may never say the word proud. That syllable may always stumble in his mouth. But when he introduces me now, he says my daughter without a smirk. And sometimes that's enough. If you've stayed with me to the end of this story, I'll ask you to do one thing. Think about the words you use with the people you love. Do they build or do they break? Because someday, in a room full of witnesses, those words will tell the story of who you were. And the greatest revenge isn't humiliation. It isn't the silence of a room cut in half. The greatest revenge is reconciliation, living in a way that teaches others how to treat people better. That's the standard. That's the legacy.